welcome back to my channel. This week I am going to start my next big sewing project, which is Mirabel from Encanto. Now I'm hoping to have this done for Sandbox Fest, which as of today is just over a month away? 2 months away? I'm predicting right now that the costume itself is going to be incredibly easy to make. I just need to make a blouse and a circle skirt, essentially. However, the time-consuming part of this project and why I'm starting it 2 months out from its due date is all of that embroidery on the blouse and the skirt, which is all going to be done by hand. And yes, this time I'm actually going to do the embroidery by hand, not like when I said I was going to do it for my Rapunzel and I never got around to it, and to this day she is still just sitting there unfinished with no embroidery on her skirt. I'm going to do this one, I promise, because it's such a huge part of the costume. Anyway, without any further ado, let's dive on into it. Let's start with the skirt. So initially I brought 2 patterns for it. This one, a vintage one I found at the second-hand shop, and this one currently in print reproduction of a vintage pattern. Well, I thought they'd be great for it, you see, because, you know, they've got the tiers. However, upon closer inspection of Mirabel's skirt, hers isn't made up of gathered tiers. There's no gathering at the top of each of them. They're all smooth, which means it's a circle skirt. Instead of cutting long rectangles and gathering them down to make the tieredness of the skirt, I have to cut curved shapes out of the fabric. And so now I'm going to have to do drafting to try and figure out how to do these tiers. I'm not looking forward to it, but it should be relatively straightforward. Just drafting a full-length circle skirt and then splitting up the tiers should be fine. Right, now that that's out of the way, fabric. I have linen in 3 shades of blue. So obviously this will be the main makeup of the dress. I then have a bunch of assorted trims which will go along the bottom. I've got this fringe one and an eyelet lace one. As you can see, they're white, so I will have to dye those the right shades of blue. And then I have some teal bias tape which goes along the bottom, and some magenta tassels. Like I said in the beginning of this video, I think the skirt itself isn't going to take me that long to make. I think I'll probably have it done by the end of today. However, it's that embroidery that I think is going to be the real kicker here. So at the moment I have a whole bunch of different coloured wool, and I'll be using that to embroider the skirt, and I have a feeling that is going to take me months. So that's why we're starting it so early, so I can get that embroidery all done. Well, without any further ado, let's dive into making this skirt. The first step in making the skirt was to start with the first tier, and to do that I just used a basic circle skirt calculator and calculated the length of the skirt and the width of the waist here. And using the first tier that I created, I then created the second tier measuring straight down from the bottom of the first tier, and then I added a seam allowance to the bottom and top edges of that. And those steps get repeated to make the third tier as well. With all the tiers cut out, I then started on sewing the side seams together. With the side seams sewn together, it was now time to attach the tiers together. I made it too long. Yeah, the skirt panels are too long. Which means I have to get new fabric to do it. I'll show you what it looks like just now. Here it is on the mannequin. Basically this top layer should be ending about here, and then the next layer should be ending there, and then the third layer would have ended about here, but at the moment it's actually dragging on the floor. I don't know why my calculations were so off. So yeah, that was a waste of fabric. Well, I mean, not really, because I mean I can just finish that skirt and donate it to the second-hand stores so somebody can have a nice teal skirt out there. I don't know. But for my purposes, it is ruined. So I need to go buy some more fabric, and this time I'll make everything like 3 inches shorter than that one. And the reason I can't just redo this skirt is because everything's cut on a curve, which means that the lower tiers I can't adjust them. I could adjust the top one, but not the lower ones. So that was incredibly frustrating and a waste of an hour or so. Next time you see me, I will have redone everything, and yeah, it should hopefully be the right length. Skirt is finished again. So really happy with how it came together. If I hadn't have made that mistake, it would have only taken me a couple of hours, like I said. However, there's a couple of things I need to explain. First, the bottom tier is now a different fabric to the other tiers. They'd run out of the original linen colour that I'd used for the bottom, and they didn't have enough meterage left of it. So I had to find something that was close enough fabric-wise, and that here is this bottle green drill fabric. It's cool because it's still a 100% cotton, however it is a lot thicker than the original linen fabric I had. But then I thought also, because it's going on the bottom tier, it'll probably help it drape a lot nicer as well, which I do think it's doing. Second thing you'll note, I made bias tape, which I'll give you a quick little run through of how I did that right now. First I drew and cut out a bunch of straight lines across the bias of the fabric. This creates a bunch of noodles, which I then sew together to create one long continuous strip. I then trim back all of the seams and iron them nice and flat. Then I fold and iron one of the edges towards the centre, and then I repeat with the other edge. Next I place the bias tape along the seams of the skirt tiers, and sewing as close as possible to the edge, I stitch it in place. And we're back. So yeah, that just runs along the middle tier there, top and bottom. Real simple. I sewed a zipper in the back as well. And it is wearable. And of course, you can see there's some embroidery on it. So I did start doing it just to give me a gist of how long it's actually going to take. And these two little things here took me 2 hours. And so you can imagine how much the whole rest of the skirt's going to take. Anyway, let me show you what it looks like on. And here it is on. Now I absolutely love the fullness of it. It is so much fun to twirl in, and it's giving the right amount of movement and such that I wanted. I'm just so happy with how it's looking so far. As you can see, there is a lot of room for embroidery though, so how about I go get started on that? I would have loved to filmed a complete time lapse of all the embroidery I did on this to show you guys, however I just do not have the hard drive space to keep it, unfortunately. So please enjoy this one of the cloud that I did on the front here. I did so many different stitches for this, by the way. I learnt chain stitching, I did back stitching, I did long and short stitching. And then there were some other parts where I actually just used ribbon and pinned that in place and sewed as close as possible to the edge of the ribbon. Hello, I interrupt your embroidery content to introduce you to this parcel I just got in the post from the Ribbon Rose. So as you know, the last however many weeks I have been embroidering my Mirabel skirt, and probably not the most optimal position. It's had me over here looking like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I didn't know things such as embroidery stands existed until I was flicking through Instagram and a post came up by Kat Makes, and she was going through all of her embroidery stands that she has, ones that can clamp onto tables and stuff, so that you don't sit there with hunchback positions. So after discovering all that, I very quickly went and ordered myself my own embroidery stand, and here it is. With a good chunk of the embroidery done, I then decided it was time to finally dye those trims along the bottom edge of the skirt. To do that, I used a little bit of this indigo dye by Rit, and this one here is the all-purpose dye, and that is for natural fabrics, which is what I thought that these trims were. So this happened when dyeing the trim. They were both dyed in the same dye pot at the same time. They were both brought from the same place at the same time, and the listing was 100% cotton. I think this one here was 100% cotton, but for whatever reason, this one must be a blend, because as you can see, it didn't dye the same colour, which is fantastic. Luckily though, I had brought some extra meters of the same trim, so I'm now going to dye this one with the same dye and just hope that it dyes the same colour as one of these two, because currently one of these two will only do half of the skirt, so that's the predicament I'm having right now. The dye job was a success. I now have two that are similar-ish enough colours. That's totally how you pronounce that word. So before I sew them onto the hem of the skirt, I'm actually going to sew the bias onto this side first and then flip it over, reverse it. And then I'll sew that on the back and then hand stitch the top of the bias down. So let's give that a go. After sewing the bias on, I then decided it was far too much effort to hand stitch the top of it down, so instead I pinned the trim onto the back and then folded the bias over and stitched as closely to the edge as possible, and that also caught the trim underneath, so I killed two birds with one stone there. Next I got the magenta tassels and I put those in between the bias and the trim, and then I hand stitched them in place. Then I sewed the rest of them on evenly spaced around the whole skirt. Next up, the shoes. So I started with this plain base from AliExpress, and using an alcohol ink marker in a magenta shade, I just began colouring in all of the white part. I don't actually know if the ink is water safe, I haven't tested it at this point, but yeah, it did the job. After both of the shoes were coloured in, I then took a friction pen and began drawing in all the designs that she has on the shoes. I use a friction pen so that I can just use heat from an iron and then all of the markings disappear. With both the designs drawn on, I can finally start embroidering. So for this I actually used a curved needle so I could get right up close to the toe points there. But yeah, this was a long process and eventually I did get both of the shoes done. Alright, so that was 2 hours to do this one shoe here. Let's finish this one. For the shirt, I'm using the same linen fabric that I used for the skirt, but obviously in a white shade. And for the pattern, I'm using McCall's M8180 as a base. So originally I did have plans to actually digitize all the embroidery on the sleeves and the collar piece myself, as in designing them and doing them on the machine. However, I wanted to make this costume as accessible to average cosplayers as possible, and average cosplayers don't usually have access to an embroidery machine, so instead I've opted to use a bunch of embroidered trims and appliques that mimic the look of the embroidery on the sleeves and the collar. I've also decided to add a pom-pom trim along the collar, and that's purely just for aesthetics. I just thought it looked cool. Now on to actually making the shirt. So the first thing I wanted to do was shorten the length of the sleeves and add that scalloped hem along the bottom. So I'm just drawing that straight onto the original pattern, and here's how it turned out. Next I cut 2 of the sleeves out of the white linen. To finish the raw edge of the scallops, aka hemming the sleeves, I decided to do that with a black bias tape. First I sewed it to one side of the sleeve. Then I turn it over, encompassing the raw edge of the sleeve, and then I hand stitch it to the other side. Next I do the little floral detail that she has in between all of the scallops on the sleeves. So to do this I just cut out chunks of that embroidered lace that I liked and just put them onto the sleeves until they were in a pattern I was happy with. Then I used the freestyle embroidery foot on my machine and sewed around all the edges of the flowers. Now that the sleeve base is complete, it's time to do all of the hand embroidery. So I draw on the designs using friction pens again. And then using my new embroidery hoop, I get started on all that hand embroidery. Alright, both of the sleeves are now done. It only took like 6-8 hours to do. So now I'm moving on to the shirt part of the shirt. So the alterations I have to do on that is I have to eliminate the centre front button-up seam because she doesn't have one. The second alteration I have to do is lower the collar, because on Mirabel, her collar sits about there, that line there. And also, as you can see by this pattern piece, it stops in the center front and has like a low Peter Pan collar. We don't want that, we want it to continue all the way around it as well, so I'm going to have to draft that. And one more thing before I go into the drafting of this. The front pattern piece does have a dart in the bust area here, and that is really helpful for someone like me to, you know, give me some shape in the bust area rather than it like tenting out at the bust. If you have a smaller bust, it'll be fine, you don't need to do it, you can just have a straight down, because yeah. But for me, I need the darts. Right, let's get on to altering. Here I'm tracing a new neckline directly onto the original pattern piece. Happy with the shape of it, I then cut it out of the white linen. And first I sew up the bust darts, and then I do all the hand embroidery. After many hours of work, the shirt embroidery minus the collar is now done, and the hilarious thing is, once you're wearing it, you don't even see like much of it at all. Oh well, onto the collar. To figure out the shape for the neckline of the collar, I first sewed the front and back pieces together at the shoulders. Using some tracing paper, I then traced the shapes that the neckline made in the front and back pieces of the shirt. I then tape these two pieces of paper together, and that gives me the neckline shape for the collar. Using the original collar piece as a guide, I mark the width around the neckline that I've just created. Then I trace the scallops from the sleeves around the edge to give me that scalloped edge. Then I cut it out, and hopefully I have a collar piece that works. And here's what it looks like pinned in place on the mannequin. So little adjustments I'm going to make here is I'm going to cut that shape in, because at the moment it's too wide, don't like that. And I'm taking out one of the scallops on the shoulder so that it sits nicer, because if I don't, it sits straight out like that and I want it to curve down with the shoulder. But yeah, I'm happy with it, and theoretically this should work. After cutting the collar pieces out of the white linen, just like the sleeve, I'm adding a black bias tape along the scalloped edge. Then I decorate each of the scallop sections with a butterfly and a daisy. For the daisies, because they were so small, I just decided to use this glue to glue them on. The butterflies, on the other hand, they all got sewn down. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to add a pom-pom trim just because I liked how it looked, so that's why it's there. So to do that, I just pinned it directly to the front piece of the collar underneath the bias tape. It then gets basted in place. Now that the collar is sufficiently decorated, it's finally time to sew the front and back pieces together. So I do that, and I just sew along the scalloped edge first. And here it is turned right way out and pressed. All I have left to do now is to do the embroidery on this side of the collar, and then it's done. Now I've got to figure out how to do the little butterfly that sits here. To make the butterfly, first you're going to need a piece of card that has the width of the wingspan that you're after. Then you just take the colour wool that you want and wrap it around until you have it the length of the butterfly that you want. Then you push the yarn up so it's all nice and uniformly touching. And then you stitch the yarn together through the centre on both sides. This doesn't have to be perfect, it's more of a basting stitch just to keep everything in place. Next you slide it off, and then using some more stitches just tack everything in place. Next it's onto the body of the butterfly, so you take one strand and tie 3 folded in half strands together, and then you braid those 3 strands together, and that creates the body of the butterfly. Once it's the length that you want, you tie a knot in the bottom, and then you just sew it in place onto the wings that we created earlier. With the butterfly done, I can now finish the rest of the shirt. So first I baste the collar to the shirt. Then I sew the side seams of the shirt together. Next I sew the side seams of the sleeves together. Try saying that 10 times fast. And then the sleeves get sewn into the shirt. All that's left now is to make the facing for the collar. To do that, I trace the neckline from the pattern piece, and then using the original facing as a guide, I then add the width to the piece. It then gets cut out of both the linen and an iron-on interfacing, and then the iron-on interfacing gets applied to the linen. With the interfacing applied, I then move on to finishing the edge of the facing. So first I overlock the edge that will not be sewn to the collar, then I sew the centre back seam together, and then I roll over the overlocked edge and create a 1/2 centimetre seam. The facing then gets sewn into the neckline of the shirt. Okay, so it is the night before the convention. I have finished the embroidery on the top, completely done. Shoes, completely done. Front half of the skirt, done. There are some gaps in the embroidery, but at the moment I'm running out of time because it turns out I severely underestimated how long it'd take to do all of this hand embroidery. I mean, I gave myself 2 months and it turns out that wasn't long enough. I think realistically I need another full week of working on it and I will get it all done. However, the gaps aren't that big and I think you don't notice it overall, so I'm happy to wear it tomorrow. But before I do that, I do want to put a temporary petticoat lining layer on the inside of the skirt so that when I twirl, you don't see that. Now on Mirabel, her one is a dark blue colour, so I have this 100% cotton, which I am just going to cut out just a tiny bit longer than the skirt itself, and then I'm going to put a eyelet trim along the bottom edge of it, which you can see it peeks out underneath the tassel layer. So let's get to cutting this out and temporarily inserting it into the skirt. I am so tired at this stage. So the first thing I do, using my tried and true circle skirt method, is to cut out a very long circle skirt. Next I sew the side seams together, and then I add the eyelet trim along the bottom edge of the skirt. And I forgot to show it here, but once the eyelet lace was sewn on, I then just temporarily tacked it into the waistband underneath the skirt. Alrighty, onto the earrings. Here is one I made earlier, and to make this, these are the pieces I used. 2 different size pom-poms, a earring thing, a pokey thing, and a ring thing. First, you take the long pokey thing and poke it through the large pom-pom. Then using a pair of pliers, we then have to take the pokey end and turn it around so it becomes a ring end encasing the pom-pom so that it won't escape. Then I take the ring and I thread that through one of the ring ends on the big pom-pom and attach the earring part by threading that through the ring part on the earring. This is very technical, as you can tell. I really know what I'm talking about here. Then I take the smaller pom-pom and some contact adhesive and I put some on the pom-pom and on the earring part and I glue them together. So there you have it, that is how I made my Mirabel Madrigal costume from Encanto. Now, for such a simple costume, like construction-wise, I love this. It is so beautiful, it is so much fun to twirl around in, and it's really iconic for just being a shirt and a skirt. I loved it. My only regret is that I didn't finish all the embroidery on time, and I really do hope that I do eventually finish it, because this is easily one of my funnest costumes and one of my most comfortable costumes. I can easily see myself chucking it on for like a Christmas parade in town or something, because yeah, she's just really fun and comfortable, and I don't usually get that in my costumes. I'm really glad I took the time to do all of the embroidery by hand, because I think it just gives it an extra homemade touch, which is what I feel hers has, whereas if I'd done it by machine, it looks machine embroidered, you know, and I don't think she was rocking an embroidery machine whenever this movie was set. Anyway, with all that being said, I really hope you guys liked this video. If you really liked it, maybe consider leaving a like down below, perhaps even a comment, and if you really, really liked it, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting, and fun related things here on this channel. I usually try and upload every week or so. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye!